Hi, I'm Tom Bolden, Tenmile Distillery's whiskey aficionado and history buff. I'd like to talk to you the next few minutes about the inspiration behind the latest release in our Revolutionary War Whisky Series, the Battle of Quebec. The Battle of Quebec was the first big crushing defeat of the Continental Army and ended any hope of making Canada the 14th colony. But it was a tale of terrible suffering, but heroic efforts, and a plan that fell apart in the bitter winter cold.
By late 1775, the Revolutionary War was still in its infancy, but the Continental Congress was already thinking ambitiously. The plan seemed logical: invade Canada, remove it from British control, and convince French Canadians to join the fight for independence. Without British Canada as a northern base, British forces would be cut off from New England, and the Americans hoped that Catholic French Canadians might welcome liberation. Two separate forces would execute this ambitious strategy. Richard Montgomery would lead troops north along Lake Champlain, capture Montreal, and advance towards Quebec. Meanwhile, Benedict Arnold would undertake a daring march through the Maine wilderness and link up with Montgomery for the final assault. It was a plan built on speed, surprise, and hope. Richard Montgomery was an Irish-born former British officer who had resigned from the Army and settled in New York. Respected for his discipline and modesty, he had already achieved a significant victory at Montreal in November of 1775, proving his capabilities as a military leader. Benedict Arnold was his opposite in temperament. He was ambitious, charismatic, and willing to take extreme risks. Already celebrated as a hero from the seizure of Fort Ticonderoga earlier that year, Arnold volunteered for the grueling backwoods march, demonstrating the bold leadership style that would define his early career. Facing them was Governor Guy Carleton, a calm and experienced commander who had skillfully escaped from Montreal to Quebec to organize the city's defenses. He commanded British regulars, Loyalist militia, and Canadian volunteers who were prepared to defend the city. Arnold's march through Maine has been compared to Hannibal's crossing the Alps, and with good reason. His route cut through unmapped wilderness where men hacked through forest, paddled rivers, and hauled boats over mountains. Flooded rivers destroyed food supplies, forcing desperate soldiers to boil leather for soup. Disease, exhaustion, and desertion plagued the expedition. By the time Arnold finally reached Quebec in November, his force had been reduced by almost half. Montgomery's march was considerably less demanding. Following the Lake Champlain route, he seized Montreal with minimal bloodshed and moved on to Quebec. When the two armies joined up early December, they had approximately 1,200 men. They were cold, tired, and hungry, but still determined to achieve their objectives. Quebec presented a difficult challenge. Built on high ground with stone walls, narrow, winding streets, and gates that forced attackers into deadly choke points, it was a defender's dream. Winter conditions made any siege activity nearly impossible, and with British reinforcements expected to arrive in spring, time was working against the Americans. Inside the city, Carleton commanded roughly 1,800 defenders, including British regulars from the 7th and 26th Regiments of Foot, Loyalist militia, French Canadian volunteers, and even sailors from Royal Navy ships frozen in the harbor. The defenders had shelter, supplies, and strong defensive positions. Montgomery and Arnold faced a critical decision. Morale among their troops was deteriorating, and many enlistments would expire at year's end. They could retreat and abandon the entire campaign, or they could strike immediately. They chose to attack on the last night of the year, hoping a snowstorm would conceal their approach. The battle plan called for a coordinated attack. Montgomery would advance from the west along the narrow St. Lawrence shoreline. Arnold would assault from the north, targeting the lower town. Two smaller diversionary forces would attack the walls directly, drawing defenders away from the main assaults. If successful, they would capture the lower town, push into upper town, and force Carleton's surrender. Just before dawn, the Americans moved out into a howling blizzard. The storm was so fierce that muskets sometimes failed to fire, but it also provided cover for their advance. Montgomery's column advanced along the riverbank towards the first barricade. As they got close, a small group of defenders opened fire. Cannon loaded with grape shot tore through the front ranks. Montgomery was killed instantly, along with several officers. Without their leader, his men broke and fled into the storm. Arnold's column fought through narrow streets toward the lower town, facing fierce resistance. Canadian militia poured fire from windows and rooftops. Arnold was struck in the leg and carried from the battlefield, leaving Captain Daniel Morgan to take command. Morgan's men fought on bravely, capturing a barricade, but the defenders quickly regrouped and surrounded them. With no reinforcements coming and Montgomery's forces already defeated, Morgan had no choice but to surrender after hours of brutal fighting. The numbers tell the story of the defeat. Americans suffered approximately 60 killed and 400 captured, including Morgan. Arnold, wounded but alive, was evacuated to the American camp. British and Canadian losses totaled fewer than 20. Despite the crushing defeat, Arnold refused to abandon the campaign and maintained a loose siege through the brutal winter months. However, when British reinforcements arrived in May 1776, the Americans finally withdrew down the St. Lawrence, ending the Canadian campaign entirely. The Battle of Quebec was a clear failure. Canada remained firmly in British hands, and the loss damaged American morale after a year of early successes. Yet the battle also created heroes and valuable lessons. Montgomery became a revered martyr, with Congress ordering a monument in his honor. Arnold's reputation as a bold and fearless leader soared, setting the stage for his later prominence and his eventual betrayal. The battle revealed harsh truths about warfare. Winter operations in hostile terrain are brutally unforgiving. Boldness cannot replace proper preparation and logistics, and local support can determine a campaign's outcome. Though the Americans failed at Quebec, the story of courage and sacrifice would be used to inspire rather than discourage the revolutionary cause.